Good. Yeah, so thanks. And I got this fantastic broad title, sort of an academic perspective to societal resilience. That could take us a few days, if not longer, to actually go through this. But what I'll do is I'll start with just some of the basic ways in which we all, in a sense, understand resilience, insofar as we may understand this topic or this particular concept whatsoever, because resilience isn't the sort of word that we use in the everyday. Well, I mean, maybe some people do, but I'm generally, in my personal life, I don't go around asking, the kids, how's your resilience today? It's more so an analytical concept to try to understand a process taking place in society. It can be very simplistically, but not necessarily correctly, implied to be a capacity almost like bouncing back from a crisis. Like resilience suggests that within the term that there is a capacity either at the individual level or at the societal level, perhaps also at the state level, that if that unit, be it individual, society, or state, is confronted with a challenge, with some sort of a crisis, the resilience refers to that unit's capacity to address in some way that crisis and then bounce back, you could say, back to this normal state prior to the crisis. So that's one way that resilience has been understood. And I have, to a certain degree, seen this this way of understanding resilience, and not least on NATO websites. So I will be corrected if I'm wrong. I was looking forward to actually having Ms. Frederike Dans to talk about this prior to me. But this idea that, one, there's a normal state, two, there's a crisis, and three, after the crisis, we bounce back, and bouncing back is usually assuming a time frame that is relatively short. So quite often there's an idea, or at least a hope, that there is a bouncing back quickly, as in it goes boing, and then back to sort of a normal state, which suggests almost pre-crisis state. So that's one way of understanding resilience. Now, I may have completely, how do you say, thrown NATO under the bus on that representation of that definition, but there's a problem with that particular definition, and that's what you see on these sort of like academic perspectives. It's the idea that, well, whatever is the normal state, if there is a crisis, to begin with, the notion of bouncing back becomes already problematic, and that we just have this sort of springboard effect. If we have a good capacity for resilience, somehow it's we go back to normal. Very rarely does something like that happen. And one excellent example, and I'm going to be referring back to this frequently then, is the pandemic. The pandemic itself is a crisis, at least of a particular type. It's not a militarized crisis, or doesn't necessarily have to be. It could become that, but it's not in departure point a militarized crisis. It is in a way a crisis of nature, insofar as you're not really getting into the whole like a leak from the lab argument. But let's just say this happened from nature. And there's a certain virus that breaks out and leads to a pandemic. The pandemic is an excellent example to demonstrate how bouncing back isn't necessarily the go-to reaction after a crisis. As we can tell, we're heading into having had 2 years of the pandemic and bouncing back to normal, how life was prior to the crisis, prior to the pandemic, is already highly, highly unlikely. It is also not going that quickly. So that whole sort of bouncing back thing is highly problematic. But one could say, well, what about another type of crisis? You could have a crisis where the power goes out, and the power goes out because there's something that has happened technologically at the power station. This can be repaired fairly quickly, and then through that kind of a crisis, that we bounce back because suddenly the lights are on and we're good to go and no problem. But that's rarely considered much of a crisis, at least when it's happened. It's, you know, it's just a technical problem. There's not an assumption that the power has gone out due to an external actor that may be causing certain problems, or that there's perhaps a much bigger disaster behind the power outage, let's say a landslide or a flood or something like that. In these sort of broader crisis situations, this is how we have to think, is that do we bounce back to that sort of pre-crisis kind of normal? And it rarely is like that, because even if it's a natural crisis, we may think, what happened during that crisis, or what happened prior to the crisis that led to the crisis? If it's nature, it's a landslide, we don't have enough walls against the mountain that slid down, or we're not prepared for climate change that is now softening clay areas and creating landslides. So we're changing things. And what are we doing? We're adapting. So the bounce back theory already kind of falls off the rails, because quite often with crisis, we don't just bounce back to the previous normal. We try to adjust and we adapt. And so we enter into language of adaptation. And there's a long lecture one can have about adaptation as well, and some of the challenges around that term as well. But adaptation is suggesting that we're making adjustments, that we identify what is the problem and can we solve that problem such that the likelihood that that problem won't happen again. We may have to change something either technologically in our society or change certain habits in our society, and so on. So that's where the adaptation comes in. The time period is also extremely important in our understanding what is resilience. So resilience it's challenging to refer to as bouncing back. It may be even challenging talking about adaptation, because already if you're adapting, there suggests then a certain amount of time passes. And that amount of time, we're also still experiencing the repercussions or the ongoing process of the particular crisis. So while we may be adapting to problems that we identify at the start of a crisis, and we're thinking, let's adapt and let's revamp our this and that type of a system, the crisis continues and society is reacting to that crisis. And certain things can happen to society while we're working on adaptation, so that the end result, if we start coming out of the crisis, even our adaptive measures may not necessarily suit the society in question by that time. So time plays a really important role in our understanding what resilience is about. And so this is also typically academic, right? Because we want to complicate this. We're not going to make an easy solution and say, if you do 1, 2, and 3, there you go. You are now a resilient type of society. There's also the question in academic circles about whose resilience are we talking about? And this is very important too, is thinking, and that means we're looking at the actors involved. When a whole society is involved in a type of a crisis, whose responsibility is it to act to bring that society back to if not the previous normal, at least a new normal, where people aren't constantly having to prepare, think about, adjust, and regulate the crisis in question. So in the case of a pandemic, it would be at the point where we may be at a new normal. That new normal may be, we have vaccines we did not have before. We still engage in certain practices. We might still engage in social distancing, but that becomes part of the new normal. Even wearing masks on public transport, that could be part of the new normal, or at least normalize that certain people who are vulnerable will start doing it. So we start getting these new measures in the new normal. But over time, something has happened to society where possibly the resilience is expected to just, or that the resilience is weakened or could be strengthened, but it really depends on the actor. So while we're going through this crisis, is it the government who has to solve the crisis? And then we as citizens, we just sort of sit and we wait and, and then to a certain degree, that's kind of important because you'd like society to act in concert in response to a crisis, that we're all kind of on the same page, on the same team, and so that there's a certain controlled response, you could say. That has happened with regards to the pandemic as well. Our governments have come with either recommendations or actually laws saying you can't do this or you should do that or what have you. But there could be other actors involved or assumed actors. We may, in certain crisis instances, militaries may be involved, not always, hopefully not even most of the time, depends on what kind of crisis we're talking about. Could be NGOs are involved, non-governmental organizations, that there's a role to play. So we're looking at the whole sort of society and seeing, well, who has a particular role to play? A lot of civilian services often are deployed. This could be from health services to legal services, policing, and all these sorts of things. But also included in all of that are people, us, civilians, average folk, and the ways in which we, as the average people, how much we are also responding and what our resilience levels, and what are those dependent on? It depends a lot on a concept that's very important to resilience, called trust. Well, not just called, that term, trust, I trust you, you trust me or not. Even more importantly, we trust our authorities who are trying to engage, to take control of the crisis, to solve the crisis. To what degree do we as average people actually trust the authorities or other, or a variety of authorities? It could be from military to police to our health authorities, all these different types of authorities. To what degree do we have trust in these sorts of authorities? Because it's not the same around the world. I think we've seen a lot of really interesting examples of that, again, also with regards to the pandemic. There's certain countries where the trust is quite high in the multiple governing authorities that they have. So therefore, people follow along. They follow the recommendations. They do what the government is suggesting, either recommending or actually putting into law. That's in societies of high trust, say with the case of the pandemic. But there are societies where there isn't high trust, and that makes an interesting difference. And that does a lot to resilience and whose resilience we're talking about. We could say the resilience of the individual may depend on an individual thinking, I know what's best for me. It may not be necessarily the recommendations coming in that all of society should follow, but my ability to come back to what I desire as a normal, I will do it by myself. So if I'm in a pandemic, I may make a choice that I don't want to wear a mask because there's something in my view about my lifestyle or my new normal. I want to get back to my new normal. No masks, no vaccines, no distancing, none of this. I'm not going to do any of it. If we have enough people who think that that is their response, resilience response, that can have an impact on the ability for society as a whole to handle the pandemic. I know I'm getting into sort of like maybe very politically controversial territory, but it is actually really important. The degree to which we may act both as individuals, how we act as individuals, and whether we choose to act with society or perhaps in a different direction than society with the regulations of our government or go in a different direction will have an impact on the resilience of that society. And trust, therefore, actually has a very big role to play on how people are making their individual decisions, because their decisions actually really count. If enough people make decisions that go away from what the societal recommendations are, this can really impact the ways in which our society can at all bounce back, or even what kind of new normal is established at a later point in time. The longer a crisis goes, the higher the chance where trust levels can swing, perhaps more than they would have if the crisis was shorter. confidence in what authorities are doing may be reduced, or perhaps we are learning from our authorities that our authorities actually really have this figured out, so it can go over a long time and trust levels are high. It really depends on the departure point of the society, the trust levels within that society, and how people also react to each other and the trust that they have with each other. So that is a sort of a short, a brief way of talking about the different levels. You can say the different levels of analysis, but the different levels of actors who are responding in a crisis, that who the actors are extremely important to what resilience looks like. That resilience is more often than not a simple process, but can actually be very much complicated over time during the duration of a crisis, as well as due to the nature of the crisis. The more politicized a crisis is, the more difficult trust becomes, the more difficult resilience becomes. So there's all these different factors we need to keep in mind when we're talking about societal resilience and being able to handle a crisis. I think one of the last things I want to say is that quite often the crises that we are possibly talking about often are targeting or are affecting what you can call as the civilian domain. That is the domain where we're living in, and often influence a lot of civilian authorities, so that the primary actors for a lot of crises actually lie within the civilian domain and not necessarily in a military domain. So that's also something that's very much worth discussing, is what roles do militaries play? And that also depends on what kind of society we're talking about, and what the relationship of society to the military is prior to the crisis, but also that we have to start thinking outside of the box as far as, if we haven't done already, how to respond to crises and how people are part of that response, how to integrate and include the average citizen in responses to different types of crises. And I can just leave it at, it can have something to do with the pandemic or any other crisis. Today, we see through hybrid threats, in particular, that these under threshold type of threats are targeting the civilian domain, such that the response almost always necessarily has to be of a civilian nature. So getting an understanding of how these sorts of threats are both manifested, how they take advantage of vulnerabilities in societies. Vulnerabilities can include a lack of trust in society, so try and find out what polarizes people, what turns them against each other. All of these are things that are now more and more targeted due to the digital age we are part of, and disinformation, for example, and other types of hybrid or cyber threats that can impact society. So I will leave my comments at that, I think. I'm sort of like kind of looking at my time, and I think I went about 25 minutes or so. But anyway, I'll just throw that out there and we can talk about that.